The time is at hand.
From the land of the rising crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, you are in dark places. They say time flies when you're having fun, so it's kind of hard to believe that we have passed 200 episodes. This is 202. And 2024 has zipped right by. We're entering 2025 now. Art Bell used to always have predictions for the new year on his New Year's show. I like to kind of keep that tradition going. So this week on the show, we're going to have some predictions and stories about time loops and parallel universes and all that good stuff. And here are some predictions for 2025. Patricia says streaming costs are going to increase. Yeah, why not? Everything else is going up. Let's just raise those two. Betty says more AI integration. And I can see that too. And just so we know, AI is demonic. Deborah says there will be a major cyber attack. Rose says that the water crisis will get worse. I remember seeing a psychic on that show Sightings talking about water issues and that water would be hard to come by in the future and that it would kind of be like oil or something and people would be paying top dollar for water. And I think he might have been onto something. Al Cole says it's only going to get worse. And yes, it is. Nick says the aliens are sending drones to enslave us all. Rose says it will suck too. High probability. Here's a weird little story. A detachment of the Roman army seems to have returned to the English cathedral city of York, called Ebercum in Roman times, more than 15 centuries after they had left it. A heating engineer, Harry Martindale, was working on some pipes in a cellar of the medieval treasurer's house when he heard a trumpet call. In terror, he watched as a figure wearing a kilt and carrying a round shield marched through one wall. It was followed by an officer on horseback, and then a column of about 14 or 16 unkempt and dispirited men. Martindale cowered in one corner as they marched diagonally across the cellar and vanished through the far wall. Most remarkably of all, the men marched thigh-deep in the floor of the cellar. He glimpsed their feet only where they passed through a hole dug in the floor. Martindale believed they were marching on the old Roman road, now buried. Martindale's mention of round shields, which Roman soldiers did use, caused puzzlement at the time. Later it was found out that the 6th Legion, based at York, had been strengthened with auxiliaries with round shields. So did he see just a whole big fleet of ghosts? Or like a little time slip? Good stuff. There are some cases of time slips where buildings reappear on their old sites many years after their demolition. Natural features of the countryside can also reappear, as in one time slip that occurred to a woman driving alongside the river Tweed in the Scottish border country. A large area of this beautiful valley is administered by the Forestry Commission, but at the time of this experience, they had not begun their planning. Since the 15th century, the valley had been farming country. Sheep and cattle were grazed there and provided a target for hungry raiders from both sides of the border. So at the time of this drive from Moffat to Edinburgh, the valley would have been open, rolling hill country with a certain amount of woodland. But the woman in fact drove through a great forest of tall trees, composed, as far as she could tell, of Scots fir, ash and oak, which made up the indigenous forests of Scotland. The later forestation is quite different, for it consists of spruce, pine, and larch. The Romans had reached this area. They built a signaling station outside Moffat at the great hollow called Devil's Beef Tub. Although no Roman road was ever built along the Tweed Valley, an ancient track once ran there. It may be that the modern road picks up its course for a while, and sometimes the memories associated with it. Mrs. Phyllis Hester was standing by a table in the old hall of St. William's College in the ancient English cathedral city of York, and felt herself to be dressed in a long robe, and to be at a much earlier time in the building's history. She was surprised when she came out of her reverie and found herself in her modern short dress. Mrs. C. Madison traveled in a bus in southern England. It was February, the weather was bitterly cold, and snow was falling. She was dressed in boots and trousers and a heavy coat. She set out on her journey. As she sat in the moving bus, she was overcome by what, in her later account, she described as a peculiar feeling. I no longer had trousers and coat and boots on, but a bonnet, cape, and long dress. If I rubbed my hands together, I could feel the silk of my skirt. I jerked myself back to reality and stared out at the snow-covered roofs. Then it started again, jolt, jolt, as though I were in a horse-drawn carriage. I started to twist my fingers anxiously, and for some reason I felt a great urgency to get somewhere. But where, I did not know. On we went, and I felt the long ringlets bouncing on my neck. This brought Mrs. Madison back to the present, and she realized that the sensation was caused by her fur hood tickling her neck. However, the experience was not yet finished. She found that she did not recognize many of the small shops in the village that she passed through. There were no pavements, only cobblestones, and I suddenly became aware of absolute solitude. Then the present again returned with a rush. When the vehicle reached a point at which there should be traffic lights, Mrs. Madison saw an old signpost. One arm bore the legend St. Albans. The crossroads were muddy and deeply marked by the tracks of wheeled vehicles, but they were not tire marks. The phenomenon did not cease until the woman alighted at her destination. To apprehend the present more or less simultaneously with the past or future in this way is highly unusual. The woman felt a strong indication with the Victorian woman whose attributes she had apparently taken on, and the incident made a profound impression on her. Here's another incident in which those involved not only perceived another time, but actually took part in the events occurring in it. During the Second World War, Mrs. B.W. McDougall, who was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, was traveling with two friends to the RAF station at Abington in southern England. They did not know the area at all, having never previously visited it. They were therefore disconcerted to find they had missed the transport sent to meet them. Rural England in midnight in December and in wartime blackout was not the happiest place to be. They had no choice but to walk to the camp. Having lost their way, they found themselves approaching a bridge. The night was cold and showery, so there was no thought in their minds as they passed under the bridge except to get to camp as soon as possible. The moment they were beneath the bridge, Mrs. McDougall felt the situation change. She seemed to be transported to another time, the time of the peasants' revolt in the 14th century. I was one of the crowd of people scurrying under the bridge, getting out of the way of trouble. It was hot. I smelt the sweat and felt the heat of bodies pressing close to mine. I also felt the roughness of coarse clothes, and knew my heart was beating with fright. I was conscious of heavy coarse cloth chilling at my feet, and had a feeling of dread and unease. As soon as she emerged from the bridge, she found herself back in the present. The interlude had lasted only a few seconds, but its impression was vivid and lasting. Disturbances may very well have occurred in the Abington area during the peasants' revolt, but whether the incident described by the witness ever occurred in reality is not known. But while it lasted, the 20th century girl felt herself to be a 14th century woman. In 1896, a small boy in Hanley, Staffordshire, in English Midlands, was given a severe beating by a sadistic schoolmaster for some minor misdemeanor. The child was very young, 7 years old, and sensitive. Instead of going to school in the afternoon, I played truant. I remember even now running along the street, scraping my iron-shod boots on the pavement so as to strike sparks. Also stopping to listen to organ music coming from a little church, although the church was empty and locked up. Across the road, at the end of the street, there was, and still is, an archway to the street running at right angles. It led to the backs of the houses and shops. To the left it was very short, as there were only two, I think, houses, and it was terminated by a blank wall. At the other side of the wall there was a vast area of wasteland. On this particular day there was a doorway in the wall, and when I went through I found myself in a different world. A small town with houses, nothing like anything I had ever seen before. I went along one street, and all the houses were empty. I entered several, but came out again without attempting any exploration. Eventually I stayed in one of the houses, and going upstairs, I came to a large room, looking onto a landscape I had never seen before. The land sloped away to a valley, although I could not see what was at the bottom, and beyond there were 3 covered hills. Even at that age I was fascinated by the sun and the stars, and I realized that I was facing east. That was the vision. What my physical body was doing, I haven't the slightest idea, and I can't think of one. Most certainly, an adventurous boy of 7 would not play truant just to go to sleep. These recollections were described many decades later, when the subject of the experiences had retired from a career as a professor of electrical engineering. The events of the vision anticipated occurred during the First World War. Early in 1917, the Germans broke off to the Somme battles and made a retirement of about 40 miles. Besides taking the high command completely by surprise, they left 40 miles wide. I was sent to 4th Army headquarters, which was established a little way east of a deserted village called Villers-Carbonel. It was close to the river Somme, where it runs northward, before taking an abrupt turn to the west to St. Quentin. One evening I had some hours free, and I decided to explore some of the neighboring villages, make a few sketches. I came to a village called Misery, and when I entered, I had that feeling which is described as hair-raising. I was in the street of my earliest vision. All the people were gone, apart from dead Germans I found in several houses. I entered and hurriedly left. Then I found a house free of these unpleasant occupants, and going upstairs I found myself in a large room facing east. The landscape was exactly as I found it before. The valley was the Somme Valley, but as Misery is some way back, the river is not visible. There was another curious factor. In his childhood hallucination, the subject had happened to notice that the village street in which he seemed to find himself was named Windmill Street. When the professor revisited Hanley in about 1960, he found that an estate of houses had been built on the waste ground beyond the archway he used that day in 1896. One of his streets was called Windmill Street. Most of us believe that time flows along like an ever-rolling stream, but modern science is discovering that the reality may be more complex, and that time travel may be physically possible. John Gribben reports. Thanks, John. We are all time travelers, moving at a certain distance in time with every full rotation of the Earth, a distance that is generally shared by everyone else. That is the reality of our everyday lives. But who has not speculated on the possibility of varying this steady progress, so that we either speed up while everything else around us seems to move more slowly, or somehow drag our feet so that everything hurries by while we are left behind? And what of the possibility of travel backward down that same road to visit the past and even perhaps alter it? Even if physical time travel is impossible or impracticable, what about the possibility of communication across time in the form of dreams, visions, and ghosts from the past? Seemingly, perhaps, science does not acknowledge the possibility of physical time travel in certain circumstances. This, however, demands a new way of looking at reality to provide a bridge between our everyday experience of time rolling steadily forward and the bizarre possibilities that stem from abandoning this common sense view. It is best to look first at some of the puzzles and paradoxes inherent in the possibility of time travel. The discovery of a paradox to the unimaginative demonstrates that time travel is impossible. To the truly imaginative, however, a paradox is a challenge to find a more radical solution. Scientists have had to become accustomed to doing without common sense. The idea of steady flow of time is already outmoded by experiments involving particles that travel at speeds close to the speed of light, under conditions where Einstein's theory of relativity, far removed from the usual world of common sense, provides the best description of how the universe works. Time, like space, is elastic, not rigid, and Einstein's description involves a blending together in which time and space are seen as two sides of the same coin, a coin dubbed space-time. Both time and space can be stretched and squeezed depending on circumstances, and time can be traded for space as long as the appropriate total balance is maintained. This is all solid, sober, scientific fact. Relativity theory is confirmed by the direct measurement of what happens to subatomic particles whirled at huge speeds inside modern atom smasher machines, such as the Large Hadron Collider, or those evil guys at CERN. Accelerators. It is fact, not speculation, that such a particle has a longer lifetime than a stationary counterpart, and it is fact that an astronaut sent on a journey at a speed that is a sizable fraction of the speed of light, 186 miles per second, ages less than the rest of us left behind on Earth. Another way to stretch time entirely within accepted modern scientific thinking involves sitting in a strong gravitational field, the sort of gravitational field you might get near a sizable black hole. This does not necessitate traveling through the black hole, just sitting in its gravitational field and watching the universe go by, seemingly at a speeded up rate. Both tricks are forms of time travel. They get the intrepid astronaut into the future faster than the usual rate, but if he doesn't like what he finds there is no way back home. Time may not be a steadily flowing stream, but even within the framework of modern science, it is usually regarded as a one-way street. Hurrying forward may just be possible. Bucking the stream and swimming back into the past just isn't on. The reason why such possibilities are dismissed lies in the existence of certain paradoxes, and the best way to get some idea of the paradoxes and possibilities is to look in the pages of science fiction. The key to discussion is causality, the seemingly logical assumption that events always follow their causes in an orderly procession. A bullet leaves a gun after the trigger is pulled, not before. The results of the 3:15 at Ascot reach us only after the race has run, not in time for us to be able to rush around to the betting shop and make a killing. The logical implication is that time travel involves violation of causality. Then it must be impossible. If a theory tells us we can commit suicide, then go to a restaurant and enjoy a good dinner, then the argument goes, there must be something wrong with the theory. This is not a scientific proof or disproof. It is a matter of philosophy and logical argument, and the universe may yet hold a few surprises for logicians. The science fiction philosophers have their own answer to these paradoxes, and their version of the debate highlights two possibilities, branches and loops in time. The hoariest example of a time travel paradox, science fiction or philosophy, concerns a traveler who goes back in time and wittingly or unwittingly prevents the birth of the person who would have been his grandfather. If so, he could never have been born himself, so it must be the case that the grandfather was born, after all. So it was possible for our hero to go back in time to prevent the birth of his ancestor, and so on. The existence of the paradox is seen by many people as proof that time travel is impossible, just as nature was once said to abhor a vacuum. Now we might say that she abhors time travel. But it is easy to imagine resolutions to this simple paradox in which the grandfather is both born and not born. The grandson both exists and does not exist. The simplest answer is that the effects of the time traveler's activities are already rooted in the fabric of time and space. His visit to the past cannot change the present because a visit is already part of history. Michael Moorcock developed the theme in his novel Behold the Man. In this, that time traveler is a disturbed individual with a tendency to religious mania, who journeys back to the time of Jesus to view the crucifixion. His time machine is destroyed beyond repair, and he finds no traces of the Jesus described in the Bible. Inexorably, as he attempts to tell people about the Jesus he came to see, he is drawn into the role of Jesus, playing out the events he remembers from the Bible, up to and including the crucifixion. So history is created, and the Bible stories are written down, ensuring that in 2,000 years' time, a certain individual will travel back in time to close the loop, like the snake that eats its own tail. This resolution of the paradox sees time as fixed in some greater fabric, with ourselves almost literally merely actors playing out predetermined roles on the stage of space-time. The alternative resolution of the paradox sees space-time as infinitely variable, with each of us as master of his or her own destiny to an extent few people ever dream of. Again, an example from science fiction makes the point. In Lest Darkness Fall, L. Sprague de Camp's hero is a 20th century man who is mysteriously deposited in 6th century Italy and averts the Dark Ages single-handedly. The story is Hockham, but the author's explanation is that having slipped down the trunk of the tree of history, the hero has created a new branch, a new time of history growing out as a result of his introduction of 20th century ideas into a 6th century environment. With only slight modifications, the idea becomes the respectable philosophical concept of parallel universes, worlds running alongside one another in some sense, with an infinite number of variations on the theme of history. If you go back to kill your grandfather, the argument runs, you have also slipped sideways into a parallel reality where the grandfather always was killed by an intruder from elsewhere, or elsewhen. So, when you come home and find history unchanged, don't be surprised. In your timeline, nothing has happened to change history at all. Taken to its logical conclusion, this view of reality argues that we have complete control over our destiny, because literally anything is possible, and happens somewhere among the infinite array of parallel universes. All we have to do is find a way to travel across the time barrier, not forward or backward, but sideways in time. It is, of course, much easier said than done, but if physical time travel remains at the very least an unlikely prospect for us, there remains the intriguing possibility that dreams, ghosts, and other phenomena classified as paranormal experiences could be just as well, perhaps better, explained in terms of information somehow leaking into our world from parallel worlds of time, as by direct communication involving time travel from the future or past of our own timeline. One of the most startling philosophical theories sees everything as being in the mind. Sir Fred Hoyle, an eminent astronomer who has a penchant for speculation and science fiction, mentioned this idea in a series of scientific book, 10 Faces of the Universe, and elaborated on the theme in his science fiction novel October. The first is too late. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all his sons away. The image of time conveyed by the famous words of the 19th century psalm is a grotesque and absurd illusion. In fact, all the events that we imagine making up the flow of time, as well as other imaginable events, exist in a kind of infinite sorting office, with each event or state in its own pigeonhole. Hoyle goes on. Suppose that each of these states your own consciousness is included. As soon as a particular state is chosen, as soon as an imaginary office worker takes a look at the contents of a particular pigeonhole, you have the subjective consciousness of a particular moment of what you call the present. Think of the clerk in an office taking a look first at the contents of one pigeonhole, then at the contents of another. Suppose he does this not in sequence, but in any old order. What is the effect on your subjective consciousness? So far as the clerk himself is concerned, he's jumping about all over the place among the pigeonholes, so your consciousness jumps all over the place. But the strange thing is that your subjective impression is quite different. You have the impression of time as an ever-rolling stream. We may all be, in fact, experiencing time travel, as well as travel between different possible universes. But because of the rules of the game, is that the clerk of the office can look at only one pigeonhole at a time. We never know it. True or not, theories such as these show that there is more to time than we may suppose, and that there are, philosophically speaking, ways around the paradoxes of time travel. And if there are ways around the paradoxes, there is no logical reason why it should be possible one day to build a physical time machine. Mary Kimber had an experience when she was 11 years old. My grandparents live in a large house that is well over 500 years old. They use one large room as a kitchen and a living room, and another for occasions such as Christmas. Now my grandfather owns a large plot of land on which he cultivates strawberries for sale. It was August, and I was in the room next to the Christmas room, making up some cardboard boxes for his trade. I felt I was being watched by someone. The door was open, and I could see into the Christmas room, and there was a middle-aged woman in a long red dress standing at the fireplace, her arm resting on the mantelpiece. The fireplace itself was different. The gold carriage of clocks and ornaments that my grandmother kept were gone, and there was an open fire burning merrily in the grate. The woman was looking straight at me and smiling as if she wanted to tell me something. I was frightened. I could not leave the room without walking past the woman. I looked down at my work, and when I looked up again, the woman had gone. I ran to my bedroom and cried. A few days before this experience, I had been in the hospital for an operation. My mother suggested that it might have been the operation that made me see the woman, but I think it must have been some sort of time slip, which made her appear from the past. I often wonder if she did have a message for me, and regret that I was too afraid to speak to her. Most precognitive experiences relate to events in the near future. One such experience occurred to a British family when on holiday in Germany. They were traveling in their car on one of the autobahns. There was nothing particularly noteworthy about the day or the weather conditions, and as far as I could later judge, nothing had occurred beforehand to prepare them for the incident. Presently they became aware of a vehicle approaching them in the opposite carriageway, apparently traveling faster than they were. It was not this that drew their attention, however, so much as the vehicle's shape. It was long and cylindrical, and there were what appeared to be round windows or portholes in the side. And out of one of these windows, looking straight at them, were 4 very frightened faces. Needless to say, the family presented equally alarmed faces at their own car window. Afterward, the travelers were unable to liken the machine to anything they had seen before. They do not appear to have observed any wheels on the vehicle, nor were they aware of any engine noise. Had the object been seen in the sky, it might have been classified as a UFO. On the ground, it looked like a vision of a far distant future, a machine that was the remote descendant of the modern car. The holiday makers were not surprisingly unnerved. But it's one of those ugly Tesla trucks. That's what I think. Another remarkable experience occurred to a London man, Mr. D'Aliso, when he was taking a walk in a tree-lined street in which he lived. The evening was warm and pleasant, and he walked slowly, enjoying the weather. It was then that he began to feel, as he described it, strange, as if in a dream. The sensation was not new to him, for he had similar feelings in the past, and they had invariably preceded some form of time dislocation or out-of-body experience. On this occasion, he continued to be perfectly well aware of who he was and where he was, although he felt that his personality was somewhat different from usual. He was a happier, more relaxed, and less tense person. He felt that he was in the same familiar location, but he was also certain that the time was not the present. He seemed to be in the far future. A haze covered the entire scene, and this haze trembled and stirred quite uniformly. He was particularly impressed by the fact that everything was extremely quiet. The traffic, in particular, made no noise. The conviction came to him that this traffic of the future could move not only in silence but also in complete safety. He felt that accidents are no longer possible because vehicles cannot crash or collide anymore. Another aspect of the scene struck the witness forcibly. The texture of the road surface and of the dwellings. They were made of the same synthetic substance, very smooth and silvery, and beneficial to one's well-being. Seemed to have qualities that no material in our own time has. Mr. D'Aliso continued to stroll along the street, enjoying the sensation and thinking, this is how it will be. After a few minutes, the haze faded, and both the scene and his sensations returned to normal. He was left with a feeling of considerable happiness. Mr. D'Aliso regards his time slips as involuntarily, and not capable of being produced to order any circumstances. They are always accompanied by the slightly dreamy, though not sleepy, sensation described. As he says, it is as if something strange and yet familiar is about to happen at a different rate. This disjointed, out-of-place sensation is a commonplace accompaniment to all time slips, whether into the past or the future. They are also frequently marked by silvery or hazy light over the scene and by noticeably absence of sound. Mrs. E. Hall of Dundee, Scotland, recalled that in the mid-1950s, when she was living in Kent, she had a most peculiar experience. She said, I lived in a house situated in a block shaped like a horseshoe, called the Drive. There was a rather large, particularly noticeable man who also lived in the Drive, and one afternoon I passed him sitting in his pale blue saloon car with the driver's door wide open. He was deep in conversation with a man who was leaning against the car. I glanced at him and passed on my way. I might mention that the car was facing away from where he lived, as though he had been on his way somewhere when he had been stopped. A few seconds after this, I rounded the bend of the drive, and to my amazement the car was in the drive of his bungalow. He could not have reversed and passed me because I would definitely have seen him, and he couldn't have proceeded on his way and approached the little drive from the other direction. It would have taken too long. From that day, I resolved to never give anyone an alibi, even if questioned by the police, to confirm that a person was in a certain place at a certain time. Bolton, Lancashire. Mr. W. was walking home around midnight along Halliwell Road when he suddenly found himself plunged into darkness. It was as if he had abruptly walked into a quarter of darkness and could not see, feel, or hear anything. He continued walking blindly and suddenly found himself in a different street and in what he thought was a different town. Certain things were slightly different. The price of fish and chips, according to a price list in a shop window, was cheaper, and Halliwell Road had completely disappeared. But on the other hand, there was so many resemblances to Bolton that he thought he had had a minor brainstorm. The atmosphere of this town made me feel really strange, he said. It seemed that every time I was about to realize what had happened, something would draw my attention away from the thought. He tried to retrace his thoughts back to Halliwell Road, but to no avail. I asked a young man who was coming out of his house if he knew where the road was, said Mr. W. He said he didn't know, but he offered me a lift in his car. I can remember thinking that it was all so curious, that it was all so ridiculous that Halliwell Road was not to be found. The very street that I asked the way from was, to my knowledge, only a couple streets away from it. And then he passed near the very spot where I had emerged from the corridor. The car seemed to float, and suddenly I found myself in the middle of Halliwell Road. I am convinced I entered a twin world, as there were places similar to the same places around where I live, and I noticed that there were no overhead lights, nor traffic lights. The strangest account concerned the experience reported by the Chester family of Chatham in Kent. About 6 a.m. on one July morning in 1966, Mr. Chester was roused by his 8-year-old daughter, Irene, crying, "Dad, wake up, please. Dawn's gone." Dawn, the youngest daughter, only 4 years of age, had vanished. Joe Chester marched into his girl's bedroom thinking Dawn had probably slid down under the blankets. But on pulling them back, it was quite obvious that Dawn was not in the bed. "She's probably hiding from us," Joe told Irene. But she was not satisfied, and neither was Joe. They searched the built-in cupboard and underneath both beds, but could not find Dawn. Mrs. Chester had, by this time, woken up and also began searching anxiously for her daughter. Windows were checked in case Dawn had climbed out, and even drawers were pulled out in the hope of finding her. In their frustration, the Chesters had stripped both of their daughters' beds to the springs, but there was nothing, not a sign. Dawn was definitely nowhere in the house. Even more puzzling was the fact that both the back and the front doors had been securely locked and bolted the night before, so that effectively eliminated the possibility that the young child may have walked out of the house in her sleep. After 20 minutes of searching, the Chesters decided to concentrate on the outside of the house. By now the tension had begun to distress Mrs. Chester, and her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. L., came out hearing her burst into tears. In fact, neighbors on both sides of the Chester house joined in the hunt, even searching the Chester home again. Almost an hour had passed. It seemed fantastic, but Dawn was nowhere to be found. She had literally disappeared from the face of the earth, and no one could accuse anybody of hallucinating. Several people at different times had joined in the search, and each had come to the same conclusion. Dawn had definitely vanished. There was only one thing to do: telephone the police. But as Mr. Chester made toward the nearest telephone box, he swears he heard a male voice saying in his right ear, "We have returned her." On hearing these words, Mr. Chester exclaimed, "She's back," and rushed back to his house. As well as feeling utter relief, related Mr. Chester, I was also shocked on entering my daughter's bedroom. There, sitting on the bare springs of her bed, rubbing her eyes as if she had just woken up, was our daughter Dawn. Everybody else went upstairs to take a look. We stood there amazed at the sight of her. In our search, she couldn't have become tangled in her sheets or blankets, for we had taken them off both beds and shaken them separately. I lifted her gently, doing my best to find out where she had been, but in vain. I even lay down on the bed springs to see if I could get an impression where she might have disappeared to. All those who helped in the search for our missing daughter were completely at a loss to explain this mysterious disappearance. Not a word passed Dawn's lips that day. It was as if she was still asleep, but with her eyes wide open. However, on the following day, she began to talk again, but she never talked about her disappearance. Jenny Dawson, sub-editor of The Unexplained, met young Dawn, by then an attractive lady of 19, and asked if she could recall anything about that episode. "No, nothing," she replied. "All I remember is going to sleep and waking up and a lot of people making a lot of fuss." If time travel is possible in principle, how can it be achieved? John Gribben explains how super-dense neutron stars could be the means by which, one day, space travelers will be able to journey into the past. Thanks, John. The philosophical debate about the paradoxes of time travel makes one thing clear. It is possible to imagine ways in which the universe may be constructed so that time travel, of some kind or another, may be allowed by the laws of physics. That leaves the big question: is time travel really possible? And if so, how could a time machine be built? During the 1970s, there was a great deal of excitement about the implications of the existence of black holes for time travel. A black hole is a region of space in which enough matter is concentrated for gravity to make a hole in space-time, a region from which no energy, light energy included, can escape. The idea of black holes as holes in space is an entirely respectable part of modern astrophysics, and they are invoked by scientists to explain a number of strange phenomena. Energy released from black holes could, for instance, explain the genesis of high-energy X-rays that have been observed in our own galaxy, and on a much grander scale. The energy sources that appear to lie at centers of certain galaxies. A black hole in space, but as Einstein taught, space and time are inseparable, two facets of space-time. It seems reasonable to suppose that a hole in space must be a hole in time, whatever that means. And if it were possible to travel through a black hole, we might emerge in some other place, perhaps even another universe, and at some other time. Unfortunately, however, such speculation seems to be nothing more than science fiction, because the journey through the black hole would crush you to death and rip you apart simultaneously. But nevertheless, the discovery of black holes has set a whole new generation of theorists thinking about the possibility of time travel. According to modern theories of space-time, refinements of Einstein's theory of general relativity, the key to time travel is not black holes, but what are called naked singularities. Kinky. A singularity is a place where the laws of physics as we know them break down, as in the heart of a black hole, for example, or in the Big Bang, in which the universe was created, and where space and time cease to exist. In a black hole, the singularity is veiled by an event horizon from which no information can escape. Some scientists, supporters of the cosmic censorship theory, believe that this is always the case. Nature always hides its singularities. Others, however, believe that singularities can sometimes become visible. Theorist Stephen Hawking has shown that black holes gradually evaporate to expose the singularity, naked singularities, at their hearts. And some scientists believe that when matter rotates too fast to become a normal black hole, it can become visible from certain directions. That is, it does not form an event horizon. Now, if a naked singularity exists in the universe, then it is possible, according to the laws of physics, to travel in an orbit around the singularity, an orbit that takes you first into the future or past, and then back home to the time and place you started from. Such an orbit is called a closed time-like line, and, of course, it implies the possibility of time travel and all the philosophical problems it entails. It is small wonder that it has caused dissension among scientists. One school of thought believes that because naked singularities imply the existence of closed time-like lines, naked singularities cannot exist. Another group of theorists points out that the Big Bang, in which the universe was born, may have been a bursting out of a singularity, like a black hole in reverse. Thus, at least one naked singularity may not have existed, but may have been the cause of our universe coming into existence. And if a naked singularity once existed inside the universe, then, because the closed timelines associated with it remain fixed for all time, it influences the whole future of space-time. If we could only find it, we would have a ready-made time machine with which we could visit any time since the beginning of the universe. But most startling of all are the ideas of a maverick American theorist that not only may closed timelines exist, but might one day be possible for mankind to create them. With 21st century physics and engineers as his guide, Frank Tipler has sketched out plans that a future civilization might use as a blueprint in building a time machine. Tipler's work, published in respectable journals such as the Physics Review and Annals of Physics, is necessarily highly mathematical and not always easy for the uninitiated to follow. But when asked straight out, is time travel possible? He replied, "My current view is that there is indeed a real theoretical possibility for causality violation in the context of relativity theory." Remember that in scientific terms, causality violation implies time travel. The tricky mathematical part of Tipler's work is the calculation that time travel is allowed within the laws of relativity theory. The universe does allow time travel after all, and there is no known reasons why closed time-like lines should not exist in the real world. The next question Tipler looked at was whether the conditions appropriate for time travel to take place could arise naturally in the universe. Finally, he has looked at the possibility of building an artificial time machine. The crucial factor Tipler discovered is the existence or creation of a massive rotating object. A large amount of matter concentrated in one place distorts the fabric of space-time by gravity. If the object also rotates, then space-time is twisted still more by the rotation, as the firm grip of gravity tries to carry the fabric of space-time round with the rotating mass. For some combinations of mass, density, and angular velocity, a singularity can be formed without creating an event horizon. The region of distorted space-time around this naked singularity is called, logically enough, the strong field region, referring to the gravitational field. Tipler has proved that a traveler from a weak field region, the Earth, say, could go to a strong field region near such a rotating object, move the direction of negative time, and then return home to the weak field region without ever violating any known physical law. He would return to find himself in the past, returning to Earth if he wished, before he left. Building a time machine is impractical now, but that may not always be the case. A working time machine can be constructed in principle by taking a sufficiently massive but compact lump of material, any material, and making it spin fast enough. Strictly speaking, the rotating material ought to be in the form of an infinite long cylinder, but Tipler believes that a cylinder 10 times longer than its diameter probably has the right proportions to do the trick. How much mass do you need? Astronomers know that in the last stage of compression before the black hole state, objects called neutron stars exist in the universe. Such a star might contain as much matter as our Sun, packed into a volume no more than 15 miles across. The name neutron star tells us that the density of such a star is roughly the same as the density of neutrons in the heart of an atom. A neutron star is, in effect, a whole star compressed to the density of an atomic nucleus. Keeping the mass of the Sun as an approximate guide, our working time machine could be made from a neutron star squeezed into the shape of a cylinder 7 miles long, rotating twice every millisecond, with the rim of the cylinder moving at half the speed of light. It sounds outrageous, but in the late 1960s, astronomers discovered sources of rapidly pulsing radiation in our galaxy. These sources, dubbed pulsars, are now explained as rapidly rotating neutron stars. Some of them spin at a rate once very few milliseconds. Most have a mass of about the same as our Sun. Of course, the spin isn't quite as fast enough to make them time machines, as these spinning neutron stars are not stretched into elongated cylinders. But the description of a pulsar is tantalizingly close to Frank Tipler's description of a working time machine. Here perhaps is the way some future spacefaring civilization might set about making a time machine. First, choose a suitable pulsar, stretch it into an elongated cylinder, increase its spin approximately, and you can open for business. There are just two remaining snags. First, such a time machine works only from the moment of its creation. Once it's made, you can use it to go forward in time and return to your starting time, but you can never go back to a time before the naked singularity came into being. Secondly, says Tipler, time travel might need a rather lot of energy. If you imagine sending a physical object into a closed time-like loop so that it ends up alongside itself, then in effect you have created a duplicate of the original object. Einstein's equations tell us that mass is the equivalent to energy. According to the familiar equation, E equals mc squared. Creating amount m of mass requires energy mc squared, and c is the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. So Tipler believes that a working time machine could be most probably used in practice only to send messages, not material bodies, through time. On the other hand, a civilization capable of sculpting neutron stars into time machines might have energy enough to squander on physical time travel as well. The problems of casualty violation remain. One of the shortest stories ever published by science fiction writer Larry Niven has the title Rotating Cylinders and the Possibility of Global Casualty Violation. Niven stole the title, he acknowledges, from one of Tipler's erudite articles in the Physical Review. The story describes a future civilization that tries to take Tipler's work to its logical conclusion and build a working time machine. Every time the work nears completion, some catastrophe strikes the builders. The punchline comes when another race discovers a half-built time machine and decides to finish the job. At the moment the leader of the civilization decides to proceed with the project, the sun in the sky of his planet blows up as a nova, and his civilization is destroyed. Niven's frightening story highlights the implications of the argument that casualty violation is abhorrent to nature, taken to its logical conclusion. The illogicality of the story may be a kind of double bluff, representing Niven's own attempt to make us, the readers, say, "But that's ridiculous," leaving us with the only possible alternative, that casualty violation really is possible after all. Tipler cautiously says only that we are a very long way from completely resolving the casualty violation question, but that coming from a respected mathematical physicist with a thorough knowledge of Einstein's theories speaks volumes. At the very least, if anyone ever tells you flatly that time travel is impossible, you can be sure that he doesn't know what he's talking about. The fairest answer modern science can give to the question, is time travel possible, is we don't know. And that, of course, means that perhaps it is possible to travel in time after all. And look at that, we're all out of time. The bosses and executives and stuff are yelling at me and making me shut the show down now. It's always kind of weird with podcasters. The host of the show is kind of in control of those kind of things. So why do they always say they're out of time? They could just keep recording. It don't matter. It's not like they're going to get fired or anything. I don't get it. But, yeah. That's all the stories and the fun times we have for this week. How's that? Thank you for listening. We'll see you again right here next week. God bless.